The city of Corinth was a major focus of the Apostle Paul's work as a church planter and as a pastor. We know more about the Christians in Corinth and more about Paul's relationship with this particular congregation than any other first century congregation. Acts 18 provides a rich description of Paul's initial visit to the city, a visit that spanned at least 1.5 years and perhaps even longer, depending on how one understands the hearing before Gallio to play into Paul's timetable in Corinth. Gallio's proconsulship can be dated rather precisely to the year 51 going into 52 AD, incidentally giving us a clear date for some part of Paul's initial missionary work in Corinth. Paul would visit Corinth on at least two more occasions, writing no fewer than 4 letters to his converts there. An early letter that has not survived but is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5, 1 Corinthians itself, a painful letter referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and 2 Corinthians. Let me spell out these known stages in Paul's relationship to the Christians in Corinth in sequence. At some point after leaving Corinth at the conclusion of his founding visit, Paul sends them a letter giving some ethical instructions, including the advice not to associate with the sexually immoral. Sometime thereafter, 2 reports reach Paul, very likely in Ephesus at this point, from 2 different sources in Corinth. He hears some things about the congregation from Chloe's people, 1 Corinthians 1:11, probably the issues of divisions, sexual indiscretions, and the lawsuits. He has also been met personally by Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, the latter two probably being slaves in Stephanas's household, given their names. Fortunatus, lucky, and Achaicus, the guy from Achaia. Stephanas likely brought the letter from the congregation to Paul, raising specific questions, a letter to which Paul makes reference throughout 1 Corinthians, beginning at 7:1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote. Paul then writes and sends 1 Corinthians, probably by the hand of Timothy, as we see in 1 Corinthians 16:10, to address the issues raised by both sets of representatives and to get the collection project going forward again. At the end of the letter, he shares his plans to visit them. I will visit you after passing through Macedonia, for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter so that you may help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you just now in passing. I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits. Paul doesn't exactly keep to this plan. He makes his second visit to Corinth en route to Macedonia. On this visit, Paul has an unpleasant confrontation with a member of the congregation, the offender of 2 Corinthians 2, verses 5 to 11, and 2 Corinthians 7, verses 11 to 12, making this visit a painful one. It seems likely that the confrontation included an attack on Paul's legitimacy as a bearer of God's revelation, given the issues that would dominate the remaining correspondence. Having left Corinth without resolution, Paul does not visit them at the end of his stay in Macedonia, returning directly to Ephesus from Macedonia and sending instead the tearful letter referred to in 2 Corinthians 2, verses 3 to 4, which incidentally elicits some criticism of Paul for not keeping his word. Paul sends this letter in the hands of Titus, and between the letter's punch and no doubt Titus's skillful intervention, provokes repentance on the part of the congregation for not taking action when the offender attacked Paul so openly. They respond now by punishing the offender in some way, probably exclusion. Titus returns to Paul in Ephesus with an encouraging report. Reconciliation seems possible, although there are still some very troublesome issues to address. The offender acted, it would appear, on behalf of outsiders who had come into Paul's field of missionary work to undermine his authority and assert theirs. Once more, the issue of who is the legitimate apostle or who is the superior bearer of revelation emerges. From Paul's point of view, They should rather have asked, who is the bearer of the superior revelation? That is, who makes the power of God more clearly present and genuine transformation more accessible? Paul then writes 2 Corinthians to deal with these issues, to cement his relationship with the Corinthian believers, and to promote renewed commitment to the collection project, which provides an opportunity for them both to reaffirm their bond with Paul and through him with the Jerusalem church. Paul dispatches Titus and the other unnamed brothers to deliver 2 Corinthians and oversee the collection. Paul will finally visit Corinth a third time, as he anticipates in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1. We learn from Romans 15, verses 25 and following, that these churches did, in fact, come through with their contribution to the collection for the poor in Jerusalem, an important symbol for Paul of the unity between his churches and the mother church in Jerusalem. This suggests that Paul and his Corinthian congregations were able at last to work through the difficulties that beset them. Paul writes Romans from Corinth, as we learn in Romans 15, 25 to 28 and 16, 23. Paul sends the letter to the Romans to Rome by the hand and in all probability through the voice of Phoebe, the patroness of a house church in Cenchrea, one of Corinth's satellite port cities. Paul would then set out with the relief funds for Jerusalem, which leads to the most trying phase of his career, his 4-year imprisonment split between Caesarea Maritima and Rome itself. The extensive excavations at Corinth, coupled with the extensive biblical texts about or addressed to Corinth, make for particularly rich connections between the two, grounding many facets of the letters in the lived world of their recipients. Corinth is a city whose history displays a dramatic before and after. It was a thriving Greek city with an ancient history, but the life of that city came to an abrupt and violent end in 146 BC as a consequence of Old Corinth's role in the Achaean League's revolt against Rome's intrusion into Greece. Lucius Mummius, a Roman consul and part of the leadership of the Roman forces, allowed his soldiers to destroy Old Corinth's walls and defenses, plunder its treasures, massacre its soldiery, and sell many of its women and children as slaves. While Corinth was not left completely uninhabited, it ceased to be anything like a functioning city. It lay essentially in ruins for 100 years, until it was founded afresh as a Roman colony, the Colonia Laus Julia Corinthiensis. This was done by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. New Corinth would have celebrated its centennial only after Paul's first visit was complete. The Roman character of the new city is dramatically displayed in the fact that 101 out of 104 inscriptions found on site from the time of Julius Caesar through the time of Hadrian are written in Latin, with only the remaining 3 written in Greek. The new colony was first settled primarily with freed persons, former slaves who, though free, still occupied a social stratum below that of freeborn persons. As such, it was a city of opportunity for the merchant, the craftsperson, and something rare indeed in the ancient world, the social climber. The city of Corinth stands on a narrow isthmus between the Aegean and Adriatic seas, whence Horace's epithet, twin seed Corinth. It was well placed to profit from trade between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The city was related closely to 2 satellite ports, Cenchrea, 6 miles to the east, and Lycaon, 1.5 miles to the north. In Paul's day, ships bearing cargoes from the east unloaded in Cenchrea, sitting on the Aegean. Their goods would be transported overland to the harbor of Lycaon on the west side of the isthmus. The Adriatic, where the cargoes would be loaded again onto partnerships heading for Italy. This facilitated trade between East and West by eliminating the long and often dangerous sea voyage around the whole of southern Greece. The cost of transporting the cargoes from the port on the Aegean to the port on the Adriatic through the city, the incidental expenses of sailors and merchants that sought Corinth's entertainments and hospitality, and especially the import and export taxes on the goods passing through, all contributed to Corinth's wealth. The city was also ideally located for north-south land travel, as this same isthmus was the only land bridge between northern Greece and the entire Peloponnese. The geography all but predetermined that this would be the site of a thriving city. As an aside, let me point out another way sailors and merchants dealt with the isthmus. From the 6th century BC on, smaller vessels, cargo and all, could be loaded onto special carts that would transport them to the other side of the isthmus along a special road called the Diolkos that was laid at the narrowest point. The Emperor Nero entertained the notion of cutting a canal across the isthmus along this road in the year 67 to make trade even easier. Josephus reports that the Roman general Vespasian, who was in charge of suppressing the Jewish revolt that erupted in Judea and Galilee in the year 66, sent 6,000 Jewish prisoners of war from Galilee as slaves to labor on Nero's project. The work proved too difficult, however, and the project was abandoned until modern engineering made it possible in the 19th century. The new Roman colony of Corinth was laid out in a typical grid pattern around a central forum across an area of about 1/2 mile north to south by 1.5 miles east to west. Residential blocks were typically about 120 feet long east to west by 240 feet north to south, although some were 120 feet squared, some 120 feet by 480 feet, depending on the spacing of the east-west roads from one another. Most of the north-south streets, called cardenes, or in the singular cardo, were only 12 feet wide, and the east-west streets, called decumani, or decumanus in the singular, 20 feet wide. There was an affluent, desirable, and park-like residential area called the Craneum, located southeast of the forum. The central forum occupied a space of approximately 15,000 square yards, an uncommonly large area. While many Greek cities and Roman colonies had both an administrative or civic forum and a commercial forum, Corinth's forum appears to have served both functions. The forum itself was marked off by columned covered porticos on all 4 sides, behind many of which sat rows of shops rented by artisans and merchants of every kind, or shops converted to serve administrative functions in the new colony. Today, the best preserved strips of shops are to be found along the north side of the western half of the forum in the far west, although these likely post-date Paul's visit, and along the south. The South Stoa was laid out in the 4th century BC as a row of 33 two-roomed shops running over 300 feet in total length. Many of these were converted into civic offices when the colony was refounded, including an oval council chamber, a public fountain, an archive, and offices for the officials in charge of the Isthmian Games. These Olympic-style games had been held every second year in the nearby city of Isthmia and brought tourists into the isthmus in droves. They were celebrated in Corinth itself, however, between 40 BC and AD 50, before returning to Isthmia in the year 50 or 51, Paul's first year in Corinth. The ongoing presence of these officials in the city's life is a reminder of the prominence of athletic competitions in Paul's world and a possible source of Paul's own use of athletic imagery. For example, his use of metaphors from boxing and foot races in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 24 and following. It is notable that the wreath given to victors in the Isthmian Games was braided from withered celery, giving poignancy to Paul's contrast between the rotting wreath for which athletes compete and the imperishable wreath with which he and his fellow converts seek to be crowned for their victory over the impulses of the flesh in 1 Corinthians 9:25. The Corinthian Christians, many of whom would have been regular spectators of the Isthmian Games, would also certainly resonate with Paul when he spoke of the rules governing athletic competitions and the potential for disqualifying oneself from the prize in 1 Corinthians 9:27. The forum was split into unequal northern and southern halves by a row of shops extending into the center from the eastern side. Halfway down this row, the series of shops was interrupted by a shrine to Ephesian Artemis, whose influence had spread to mainland Greece. Near the center of the forum, in line with this row, stood the rostrum, or in Greek, the bema, the public speaker's platform, which is also a likely place for the Roman governor to make public appearances. At the easternmost side of the forum stood a basilica, a large columned hall that typically served judicial functions in Roman cities. It was adorned with statues of Augustus and his family, including his two grandsons, Caius and Lucius, who were originally slated to succeed him before their untimely deaths made Tiberius's way clear to the succession. These statues are still housed in the Corinth Museum. As the city's economy grew, another large market area rose to the north of the main forum. This secondary forum consisted of 40-some permanent shops arranged around a central open space for the sale of wares and foods from portable kiosks. One row of these shops has been thoroughly excavated, revealing alcoves of a fairly standard 13 feet high by 13 feet deep, but varying between 9 and 13 feet wide, each with a large doorway of about 7 feet. They appear to have been fitted with lofts accessible by stone steps and wooden ladders. These lofts served as the makeshift residences for the artisans and others working in the shops below. Paul was the pioneer of tent maker ministries. To support himself while in Corinth, he plied his trade as a leather worker, a main product of his being leather tents. His words to his converts in Thessalonica could equally well have been addressed to the Corinthian congregations that he would plant. Quote, "You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we would not burden any of you while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God." We read that in 1 Thessalonians 2:9. Paul wanted to distinguish himself very clearly from the many marketplace and roadside preachers that his future converts encountered regularly at Corinth, as in any other major city, peddling one philosophy or one religion or another as a means of profiting from those who would listen to and learn from them. Paul likely spent the majority of his waking hours in Corinth working at his trade in one of the shops recessed behind the porticos surrounding the main forum or the north forum, or perhaps in another such row of shops yet to be uncovered. He no doubt counted himself fortunate to have found Priscilla or Prisca and Aquila, fellow Jews in Corinth, already well established in their rented workshop, plying the same trade as his. When the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in the year 49, Priscilla and Aquila relocated to the promising city of Corinth and set up shop shortly before Paul's arrival there. In Priscilla and Aquila's welcome of the newcomer into their own shop, we see something of the support and partnership that pious Jews were reputed to extend to one another throughout the diaspora, treating fellow Jews as members of an extended family to whom such duties were due. We might well imagine the Spartan circumstances of their lives, with Aquila and Priscilla living in a small loft above their shop, and Paul rolling out a mat on the ground floor of the shop itself every night. According to Acts, Paul began his preaching among the Jewish community in Corinth, along with their Gentile adherents. While Philo mentions Corinth as the location of a significant Jewish diaspora population, confirming the impression we get from Acts 18, there is no direct archaeological witness to the first century synagogue that Paul frequented. The Corinth Museum, however, houses two relics of the city's late Roman or early Byzantine synagogue. One of these is a section of a lintel bearing a partial inscription. The letters themselves read only Goge Hebr, but we could reconstruct Synagoge Hebraion, gathering place, synagogue of the Hebrews. The inscription was carved on a stone that had a previous life as part of a decorative ledge from another building and was discovered along the Lycaon Road, though it seems doubtful that the synagogue would have been located on one of the most prominent thoroughfares in the center of town. The second is a capital from a pillar decorated with menorahs and palm branches. It was almost certainly from the late Roman period synagogue. Paul's preaching and arguing in the synagogue had two principal effects. First, Paul drew some serious opposition to the point where he was no longer welcome in the synagogue. Second, Paul enjoyed some significant success. When he left the synagogue, he took with him, quote, a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, as we read in Acts 18, verse 7. A worshiper of God, probably meaning a Gentile God-fearer. The author of Acts tells us that his house was next door to the synagogue, which may imply that he opened up his house for Paul to continue his ministry. Paul also took with him Crispus, the official of the synagogue, who, according to Acts, became a believer in the Lord together with all his household. Those who remained behind in the synagogue, no doubt rightly, saw Paul as a competitor for the support of propertied Gentiles sympathetic to the Jewish religion, as well as a source of erosion within the Jewish community itself. At some point during Paul's first stay in Corinth, members of the Jewish community sought to get this nuisance out of the way. The author of Acts tells us that this took place when Lucius Junius Gallio held the office of proconsular governor of Achaia. A fragmentary inscription from Delphi places Gallio in Corinth during the Roman year spanning from AD 51 into 52, which incidentally becomes an extremely important linchpin for reconstructing the chronology of Paul's ministry. The North Basilica, located north of the east side of the Forum, was the governor's headquarters and would have been the place where Gallio would have conducted most of his business. According to Acts 18:12, however, members of the Jewish community brought their accusations against Paul to Gallio at the tribunal, or bema, located just east of center in the Forum, in line with the central row of shops. As I mentioned previously, this structure was probably most comparable to a rostrum, a platform from which orators could address the gathered citizenry on public occasions, rather than an official site for judicial activity, which would generally have been more appropriate for the North Basilica. Only the foundations and part of the first level of the bema remains, but it was originally a far more impressive two-story building from which the Roman proconsul could address the people and, it appears, occasionally dispense justice. Members of Corinth's Jewish community charged Paul with introducing unlawful religious customs, something that would, in fact, typically fall under the jurisdiction of the secular authority. Upon further examination, Gallio ruled that this was all just an internal Jewish affair in which he would not intervene. The aftermath of Gallio's ruling incidentally reveals something of the marginal status that the Jewish communities of the diaspora could suffer. First, Gallio is remembered to have driven them from the tribunal, not only throwing the case out of court, but throwing the plaintiffs out of his presence as well. Second, the author of Acts relates that, quote, "Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things." We read that in Acts 18, verse 17. Sosthenes, who appears to have succeeded the Christian convert Crispus as the most prominent official of the synagogue, becomes the victim of some mob action. We should imagine the non-Jewish residents of the city inflicting this abuse on him for clogging up the justice system with what was, in their opinion, some trifling inner Jewish matter. Gallio's refusal to act to protect Sosthenes or initiate action against his attackers shows consummate disdain. As the suit against Paul was unsuccessful, he was able to spend a considerable time further in that city, nurturing the congregation that would prove to be his most difficult over time. Paul had proclaimed the existence of only one God and one Lord, Jesus Christ, as we read in 1 Corinthians 8:6, calling people everywhere to give them the exclusive worship that was their due. But Paul was correct that his converts would have to continue to live in the midst of the many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords. This was a major challenge for Paul's converts in Corinth, which, like every major city in the Roman world, was home to many temples and cults of the traditional gods accepted and worshipped by the vast majority of Corinth's residents. Overshadowing all of Corinth is the rocky hill known as the Acro-Corinth, which once hosted several other temples and sacred sites similar to the Acropolis of Athens. The goddess Aphrodite had a famous temple resting on the top of the Acro-Corinth. Strabo's report of an army of temple prostitutes deployed by the goddess may represent a misunderstanding of older sources, speaking of many bronze statues of women erected in the temple itself. The city and its ports, no doubt, still had a lively sex trade, but probably not more or less than other major seaport cities of the Greco-Roman world. Nevertheless, it is noteworthy that Old Corinth had such a reputation for sexual looseness that Aristophanes could create the verb korinthiazo to mean play the whore. Plato could refer to a prostitute as a Corinthian girl, and comic playwrights could use the title Corinthiastes to name their farces about pimps. It is therefore not surprising that sexual issues are particularly prominent in the congregation in New Corinth among Paul's many churches. Today, there are no significant remains of Aphrodite's temple. In the Christian era, it became a quarry of raw materials for the walls and other fortifications built on the mountain. Throughout its many centuries of occupation, the Acro-Corinth was supplied with water by a spring over which was built the Upper Pyrene fountain, essentially a barrel-vaulted reservoir accessible by descending steps. Toward the bottom of the Acro-Corinth, still south of the city proper, stand the remains of a sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone, goddesses related to the agricultural cycle of the land. According to ancient sources, there were also sanctuaries of Isis and Serapis, Egyptian deities at the center of a popular and widespread mystery cult, Helios, the sun god, necessity, a personification or deification of the idea of fate, and the mother goddess. Perhaps the oldest surviving structure in downtown Corinth is the Temple of Apollo. The present temple, a sanctuary whose roof was supported by 40 massive Doric columns, 6 at the front and back, 15 along each long side, was built around 550 BC on an elevated plateau, the site of an even earlier Apollo temple. It overlooked the surrounding Roman period shops, both the new North Market and the northern shops of the Central Forum. It also overlooked the civic buildings, the porticos, just as it had the Hellenistic and classical era city of Old Corinth in past centuries. This was a physical and spatial symbol of the traditional Greco-Roman gods looking out over and looking out for the life of the city. For most of Corinth's inhabitants, this would have been a welcome reminder of the gods' sheltering presence. Southwest of the Temple of Apollo and west of the Forum stood a temple to Hera, the wife of Zeus and queen of the gods, once rising above the shops in the northwest corner of the Forum. In the square north of the Hera temple and west of the Apollo temple was a public fountain named the Fountain of Glauce, after the ill-fated princess of Corinth, courted by Jason and poisoned by Medea. That story forms the basis of Euripides' tragic play, Medea. Corinth was also home to a well-known Asclepion, a sacred precinct dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, that included a sleeping area where patients would seek a dream vision of the god, giving instructions for a cure or miraculously effecting the cure. Votive statues of the afflicted body parts were offered by those who believed themselves to have received healing by the god's intervention. The number and variety of these housed in the Corinth Museum bears witness to the many satisfied customers of the treatments offered in the Asclepion here. The Asclepion was also something of a health spa, with recreational areas and multiple dining rooms that could be used by the local elites for entertaining, with invitations sent to guests to dine at the table of the god. Indeed, social events throughout the city almost always had some such connection with the honoring of one local deity or another. Paul's converts in Corinth would have had a difficult time getting along socially while also avoiding the tables of idols in every respect. How far can we go? Where must we draw the line? The intersection of religion and all social and civic activities in a Roman colony explain Paul's significant investment in dealing with these challenges in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. Several smaller temples and cult sites stood within the Forum itself. A temple of Tyche, or Fortuna, stood in the northwest area of the Forum, south of the northwest Stoa and its shops. A head of Tyche, the goddess of good luck, was found on site and is now housed in the Corinth Museum. Temples of Venus, the mythic progenitor of Julius Caesar and his line, and of Apollo Clarios, graced the southwest area of the Forum, the former at least dating from the time of Augustus. As already noted, a small shrine to Ephesian Artemis interrupted the central row of shops. According to Pausanias, sanctuaries of Zeus or Jupiter Capitolinus and of Athena once stood in the vicinity of the theater, located some 200 yards northwest of the Forum. There were also some newer gods in Corinth. Julius Caesar, who had refounded Corinth as a Roman colony, was pronounced a god after his death by the Roman Senate. Historically, the first Roman to be granted that status, many of his successors would come to be divinized as well. The cult of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and later emperors spread across the Mediterranean as an expression of loyalty and gratitude to the imperial family and as a bid for imperial favors. A temple to Divus Iulius, the deified Julius, was located somewhere in the city, probably in the area of the Forum. A fragment of a dedicatory inscription to the divine Julius Caesar, as well as several pieces of what might have served as a cult statue of Julius, were found on site and are housed in the Corinth Museum. Given Julius's personal interest in revitalizing and resettling Corinth, a policy advanced also by his immediate successor Augustus, it is not difficult to imagine the inhabitants of New Corinth being quite enthusiastic promoters of imperial cult in their city. A temple was also erected to the west of the Forum for the worship of Octavia, the sister of the Emperor Augustus and the widow of Mark Antony, who had abandoned her in favor of his ill-fated union with Cleopatra VII. Though little remains of the temple today, its sacred precincts originally covered an area as large as those connected to the Temple of Apollo. Imperial games in honor of the reigning emperor were held every 4th year in conjunction with the Isthmian Games. Jews were historically known for their avoidance of participation in the worship of any gods beside the God of Israel. Many Greeks and Romans actually considered Jews atheists on account of their denial of the reality of any god but their own. Nevertheless, they were a long-tolerated oddity in the ancient world. Paul's Gentile converts, however, would have been seen quite differently. Their neighbors would regard them as betraying the gods of their forebears and fellow citizens for the sake of their new and quite intentionally chosen devotion to a foreign cult. It is no wonder that some of them, at least, would seek to make a case for eating food sacrificed to idols, as we see evidenced in 1 Corinthians 8, so as to secure smoother relationships with their neighbors and their former associates. If they could just allow themselves to be seen frequenting the temples and joining their neighbors when invited to dinner in the temple's fellowship halls, things would go much more easily for them. Paul, however, draws a sharp line. What pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Christians cannot compromise their witness to their neighbors that there is indeed only one God and one Lord. However, Paul would give them some latitude when it came to buying meat from the marketplace. Corinth had its central meat market called a Macellum in the northeast quarter of the downtown area. This area was approached from the northeast quadrant of the Forum through a monumental gateway that opened onto the main road leading to the port of Lycaon, 1.5 miles to the north. Perhaps still a gravel path at the time of Paul's visit, it would soon become a marvelous paved road surrounded by colonnades and covered sidewalks on either side. Walking north through the gate, one first passed by the fountain of Peirene, an important public water source in Paul's time on the right. The spring-fed reservoir could be accessed through the 6 archways at the southern side. Its large courtyard was a likely place for pleasant loitering. Further north sat the Macellum. By the time Pausanias visited Corinth in the 2nd century AD, this area had been converted into an enclosed building that might have functioned as a shrine to Apollo. Some portion of the meat sold here in the 1st century came from animal sacrifices that had been performed in the city's temples. This was an important and regular source of revenue for those temples, and in peak holy seasons, one of the few times that meat would be more generally affordable. In 1 Corinthians 10:25, when Paul told his converts to, quote, eat whatever is sold in the market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, end quote, he was likely referring to this well-known space. Paul claimed that the meat itself was not in any way contaminated by virtue of having come from a pagan sacrifice, though if eating such meat would contaminate the conscience of one's more scrupulous fellow Christian, Paul did command the more liberal Christians to abstain. North of the Macellum stood a bathhouse consisting at least of a frigidarium, a cold pool, and a tepidarium, a warm pool, at the time of Augustus. The caldarium, or sauna, was either renovated or first added in renovations in the mid-1st century. It also featured the perfunctory latrine. Of the bath houses discovered to date, at least 11, this is the only one that dates back certainly to the time of Paul's visit, though it is likely that a Roman city of this size had several at that time. Because Corinth was a truly new city with no indigenous landed elite, the military veterans and former slaves, the freed men or freed persons that had been settled here by Julius and Augustus, had the possibility of significant upward mobility in the midst of a world where such social climbing was strikingly rare. They would become, within a few generations, the local elites, holding civic offices, gaining wealth through trade and business, and establishing a reputation that would have been impossible in many older, established cities. Making a name for oneself, what Paul tends to refer to as boasting, one of the more common verbs in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, was not just a Corinthian thing, but self-promotion was uncommonly at home in Corinth. Thus, for example, as Corinth grew, its citizens took on more public works and gained public recognition. When one citizen named Erastus was elected to the office of aedile, the office entrusted with overseeing public buildings and festivals, he showed his appreciation by paving an area northwest of the theater complex. An inscription on the site still provides perpetual testimony to his gift, his name, and his achievement of a coveted, if junior, local public office. Erastus pro aedilitate suo pecunia stravit. Erastus paved this with his own money for the aedileship. It is tempting to identify this Erastus with the Erastus mentioned in Romans 16:23, who served as Corinth's city treasurer, its oikonomos, or city steward, and who had become by then part of the Christian congregation in Corinth, though there are counter considerations against it. The Babius monument also exemplifies the self-promoting and self-congratulatory spirit of 1st century AD Roman Corinth. Gnaeus Babius Philenus was a freed person, a former slave, who rose to the offices of aedile, local priest, and even duovir, one of the city's 2 chief magistrates. He authorized the construction of this monument to himself as a testimony to his name, success, and benefactions to the city. The monument originally consisted of 8 columns arranged in a circle, each bearing an ornate Corinthian capital adornment like this one, altogether supporting a cone-shaped roof. The same spirit of boasting, claiming honor, and calling for recognition would invade the Christian congregations in Corinth. But while boasting was at home in Corinth, Paul was adamant that competitive boasting was not to be at home in the church. What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Or in 2 Corinthians, since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. Whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. What counted for Paul was Christ alive in and shining through a believer. All that the believer did ought to point to him, his character, and his power, which Paul says is most often apparent when we have least of which to boast. As he writes in 2 Corinthians 12:9, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Each of Corinth's 2 seaports developed into a small city of its own right. These ports were named after the 2 sons born to Poseidon, the god of the sea, and the nymph Peirene. As 2 of the principal natural water sources of the city of Corinth, the one located atop the Acra Corinth, the other north of the Forum, were named after Peirene, it was perhaps natural to name the ports after her children, Leches and Kenchrias. Lechaion sits 1.5 miles north of Corinth. This was a major harbor installation, outclassed only by Ostia, the principal port of Rome, and Caesarea Maritima, the principal port of Herod's Judea. Two outer harbors were formed by the creation of three large breakwaters or moles extending out into the sea, of which almost nothing remains. An inner harbor of approximately 100,000 square yards, approached through the eastern outer harbor, was created by massive dredging operations, though they had long before now entirely silted up once again. Temples to Poseidon and Aphrodite once stood in the region of the harbor. A road on the south side of Corinth's Forum branched off to the east and led to Cenchrea, 6 miles away. The harbor of Cenchrea was created by building two large breakwaters around a natural inlet, a mole on the south side reaching over 100 yards into the sea to the west, and a mole on the north side reaching down almost 100 yards to the south. These formed a large horseshoe-shaped harbor of approximately 30,000 square yards, with a wide mouth facing the southeast. Though considerably smaller than Lycaon's harbors, Cenchrea was still sufficient for the high volume of traffic coming to and from Corinth on the Aegean. The entirety of both moles is now submerged. A bronze statue of Poseidon and a temple to Aphrodite once graced the North Mole. Excavations to the north and northwest of the North Mole have uncovered residential buildings, small industrial complexes, and a large number of Roman period underground tombs reminiscent of Macedonian tombs. These were carved into the subterranean rock like apertures into the underworld, and opened into large, somewhat rectangular chambers with 2 levels of niches. Bodies would be laid out to decompose in the larger niches on the lower level. Smaller niches on the upper level held ossuaries containing the collected bones of the deceased, or perhaps cineraria containing the ashes of cremated remains. Excavations around the edge of the harbor itself yielded signs of commercial buildings and piers. The remains of the South Mole are dominated now by a 4th century Christian church, a testimony to the eventual triumph of the work of Paul and Phoebe in this port city. The outline of the main apse is clearly visible, flanked on the north by what appears to have been a rectangular hall, and on the south by a columned portico. This church was built over the remains of a warehouse complex from the Roman period, the first of several such complexes extending out onto the now submerged South Mole. Further out, underwater archaeologists discovered the remains of a complex of fish pools for storing live catches for sale or processing. A shrine to Asclepius and a temple of Isis stood on the South Mole. While the former has not yet been discovered, the mostly submerged foundations of a rounded hall have been identified as part of Isis's temple, partially overbuilt by the 4th century Christian church complex. Isis was an Egyptian goddess who became a popular object of veneration throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. She was celebrated as a divine protector whose power could extend life beyond that which the fates had allotted and offer a blessed afterlife as well. Hers was a cult in which women could distinguish themselves as priestesses. An annual festival that opened the sailing season in Cenchrea each spring appears to have involved the launching of a new ship laden with offerings to Isis as a kind of first fruits for the profitable season to come. Paul, along with Priscilla and Aquila, would leave Corinth for new mission fields by way of Cenchrea. The harbor city also became home to a Christian congregation that met in the house of a woman named Phoebe, whom Paul commends in Romans 16:1 as a benefactor and deacon of the congregation there. It was to Phoebe that Paul entrusted the delivery of the letter that contained his most mature theological expression of his gospel, the letter to the Romans. It was in this context of commerce and cult profit, and paganism that Phoebe dedicated herself to the support and nurture of a new faith that would come quite literally to supplant these older rites.